Good morning, Michael.
Good morning, Trevor.
What are you expecting the Prime Minister to give us this week?
Well, I think the Prime Minister will be drawing a contrast between the long-term decisions that he's taking and the approach that Labour would take in office, which essentially would be a continuity of the short-term, to my mind, superficial approach that has scarred politics in the past. And the Prime Minister, I think, in particular, will be laying out the progress we're making on the economy, dealing with inflation, making sure that we continue to bear down on inflation. Dealing with inflation provides people with the biggest tax cut of all. I also expect that the Prime Minister will be laying out a vision for change in education, on levelling up, and in the NHS.
OK. Every Conservative minister I've interviewed on this programme claims to be a low-tax Tory. You've already set that out this morning. But during the past decade, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies, tax increases have cost Britain £3,500 per household. The tax burden is going to rise to over 37% by 2027. Your claim to be a low-tax Tory is just fantasy, isn't it?
No. I think it's important to recognise that whenever we can, we do cut taxes. And when David Cameron and George Osborne...
My point is you haven't been very successful. I know you say that every time, but literally keeps going up.
I think there are two things to bear in mind. The first thing is that when we dealt effectively with the economic mess that Labour left us in 2010, we were in a position to cut taxes then. Since then, however, there have been two seismic global events. The worst pandemic for a century, and war on the continent of Europe for the first time, certainly on this scale, since 1945. And that's had an impact, and not just on our economy, but on every economy. And in those circumstances, particularly after the pandemic, then we've had to necessarily ensure that the tax take is in a position to be able to cover the costs of furlough and the costs of recovery.
Yeah, let me just reel back on that. The IFS, I quoted a moment ago, says that the shift that you've created is decisive and permanent. And let's remember, since you had before we had COVID, there were all sorts of other things going on. The IFS says this shift is not wholly to do with COVID. You really have become, and there may be no shame in this, you have become a high-tax party.
No, I would gently disagree with the IFS. In the past, I've taken issues with some of these organisations with acronyms that have got things wrong in the past.
Michael, come on, stop it. These people can add up.
They can, but they're making a projection. So, of course it is the case that taxes are higher than we would want them to be. That is a fact, and it's one that, as I say, I believe is due principally to the pandemic, but also to an extent to the war in Ukraine. They're making a prediction for the future. We've just seen in the course of the last couple of weeks that other organisations have made predictions about the trend rate of growth in the UK, and those organisations have been proven wrong. We're growing faster than France, faster than Germany, all, as some would have it, despite Brexit. And so you'll forgive me for taking with a pinch of salt predictions about what we're likely to do in the future.
OK, so what taxes are we going to have cut?
Well, again, it's for the Chancellor and the Prime Minister to decide. My own view is that wherever possible, we should cut taxes on work. In other words, we should incentivise people to work harder. We should make sure that they're better rewarded for the enterprise, the effort, the endeavour that they put in.
So, national insurance?
Well, again, it is for the Prime Minister to decide.
I know the Chancellor will decide and all of that. But, you know, everybody says Michael Gove is the cleverest person in government. And it would just be interesting to hear what you think is possible. Let's start with this. National insurance, for example.
Well, I know that you'll run through a list and you'll invite me to say yes or no to each of them, but I won't. And I'm going to do, and I know it's irritating when people are asked direct questions not to answer, but I can't answer because it's the Chancellor who does it. And he...
The voters are watching, I mean, many of them are watching, and they're thinking, if Gove doesn't know, that means that nobody in the government knows, and it's a bit not reassuring that you don't have a view. I'm not asking you to predict what the Chancellor would do. I'm just asking you, what do you think, if there were going to be tax cuts between now and the election, where might they come from?
Well, it's extraordinarily flattering of you to think that people assume that I am the source of wisdom on this. But I think people are actually reassured that the government is concentrating, firstly, on dealing with inflation, as I said right at the very beginning. If you bring inflation down, that's the biggest tax cut, the biggest relief on people's cost of living that there is, then there is an opportunity to decide. The discussion about where the tax burden should fall, I think, is one that we need to take, not now, but in a little bit's time.
All right, well, let's just deal with timing.
Yeah.
Should there be a reduction in the tax burden on individuals before the next election? Are we talking the next year? Are we talking 3 years? Are we talking 5 years?
Yes, no, I would like to see the tax burden reduced before the next election.
Thank you. That's because there are some people who say, including, I think, the Chancellor, that might not be possible. But in your estimation, it ought to be possible given what you've seen in the economy and so on.
I think the critical thing is that we absolutely need to make sure that we are bringing inflation down. And as I say, naturally, everyone in the Conservative Party believes in lowering tax and particularly seeing hard work rewarded. But I can't speculate on what type of tax cut, if any, we're able to deliver until we are certain that inflation is coming down.
Can I ask you about one other thing? That there's some talk about welfare benefits being cut. The Chancellor spoke in an interview in the last couple of days about welfare spending being cut through efficiencies. And I'm wondering what you think about one of the things that's being talked about. Would that include, for example, means testing the winter fuel allowance for the elderly?
No, I think the Chancellor was very clear that he was talking about the capacity of technology to ensure that services are better delivered.
I know, he says AI will save us in various ways, but I think he also said that there ought to be efficiencies. And I'm wondering, because you've been very thoughtful on the issues of what it means to be a Conservative and compassionate conservatism and all of that. And I'm curious where you stand on this, because there are some people, for example, when I say some people, I'm talking about me, who would say that the subsidy of £500 to rich pensioners like me, who can afford to heat our homes and can watch Sky Sport without that subsidy, is really unfair and it shouldn't be protected. Now, when the Prime Minister talked about being courageous, isn't that the sort of decision that you ought to be taking? A courageous decision for the long term?
I absolutely take the point. I can see the point that you're making. Of course, it's entirely open to any pensioner if they feel that they're in a position to. If you felt that
it's very difficult, I can tell you.
If you felt that you were in a position to,
I know you're going to say, why don't you return it? It's hard.
If you want to. But the critical thing is, I think when we're looking at welfare overall, the question that I would ask, because it's a philosophical point, is how do we make sure that our welfare system encourages people into work? And I think one of the things that both the Chancellor and Mel Stride, our wonderful Work and Pension Secretary, want to do is to look at the help that we give people in Job Centre Plus and elsewhere in order to get them back into work. One of our biggest problems in this country is that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are economically inactive. Now, in many cases, they need help and support. They've been living with mental health problems or physical health problems, which require attention. What we want to do is to have a sensitive welfare system that provides support for people through difficult times, but helps them back into work.
All right. Let's talk about the issue de nos jours, as it were, rail, high-speed rail and all of that.
Yes.
Boris Johnson, your old friend.
Yes.
The man you wanted to be Prime Minister until you decided you could do it better, said on Friday that in the universities of Beijing, they teach a course in political science in which they dwell, as you might expect, on the disadvantages of democracy. And their theme is HS2, where the contrast with Chinese high-speed rail is already embarrassing, if not, frankly, humiliating. Do you feel humiliated that you can't seem to make a decision about this?
No, I don't. I mean, I love Boris, but I think that taking our lessons from the University of Beijing and the Marxist-Leninist thought that is deployed there as the doctrine, which they are trying to indoctrinate people into.
They do get the trains to run, though, don't they?
Well, actually, If you look at the way in which the Chinese government and the Chinese state allocate capital and run infrastructure projects, they are liable to massive cost overruns and inefficiencies, and that's partly because their political system has bribery built into it and inefficiency built into it. But on your central point
If I
about
go to
HS2,
Shanghai, I can get on a train. I cannot get on a train from Birmingham to Manchester at high speed.
well, actually, the journey is pretty effective and efficient. But your fundamental point, HS2, I think it is an important project. We have spades in the ground at the moment. If you were to look at the work that's going on now in order to make sure that links between London and Birmingham are built effectively, that work is proceeding at pace. However, we do need to look at value for money, and the costs of this project have been significantly greater than originally estimated. And as Conservatives, we need to make sure that we're getting value for money from every pound that the taxpayer gives us.
Are you saying that you think that it's possible that Birmingham to Manchester, which is the bit where there aren't spades in the ground, as you put it, may have to give way to other priorities?
Well, again, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and the Transport Secretary are looking at this issue now. I am a supporter of strong and good transport links for the north, but it's important to recognise that transport links in the north of England also have to be improved between cities and within cities. Here in Manchester, we've given money and indeed new powers to Andy Burnham to make sure that he has an integrated transport network in Manchester. He's taken that money and those powers. That's brought real benefits.
Andy Burnham was on last week telling us all about that. How are you going to feel, Levelling Up Secretary,
yes,
when they say, this is not going to Manchester, we've already said we're not going to do the Liverpool to Leeds line. How are you going to feel when you have to come to the north again and say, we're going to do the levelling up, but actually you won't have the rail? How are you going to sell that to Andy Burnham, to the Mayor of Liverpool, to the Mayor of West Yorkshire and all of those people?
Well, I've got a good relationship with all of those mayors.
Well, you won't have when you tell them they can't have their rail line.
And the reason that we've got a good relationship is that we recognise that the most important thing to do is to empower them to pull a number of levers. So transport's important, absolutely, but skills and education is important also, and culture as well.
I understand what you're doing, Michael, but the deflection doesn't work here. What are you going to say to these people when you go and when you turn up in the north and say, I'm the Levelling Up Secretary, I'm doing the levelling up thing, and they say the one thing we wanted that would promote levelling up, prosperity in the north, is the one thing you're not doing?
No, I don't think they would say that. I mean, of course, if I were a mayor for any northern city, I would want the maximum amount of investment. I would fight for it, and they do so very effectively. But they all recognise that levelling up is about more than one project. The levelling up white paper made clear that what we need to do in order to level up is to invest in cities, but also in towns, as we are doing and as we've announced today, and also to make sure that, for example, everything from strengthening our universities through additional spending on research and development, through the enterprise zones that we've created, all of these come together in a rich mixture which enables levelling up. You don't bake a cake with only one ingredient.
I want to come to the towns ingredient in a moment. But what I'm trying to do is to understand what kind of conservatism we are in for if you return to government. Last week, the Home Secretary said that she thought that multiculturalism had failed in Europe, including here in Britain. Now, before you throw it back at me, I once did say that I thought we should avoid using this word because everybody who uses it means something different by it.
Yes, I think that's fair.
Tell me what you think Suella Braverman meant, and do you agree with her?
I'm pretty certain that Suella was making the point that we welcome people from a variety of different backgrounds. We always have. But it's important that we have a common culture in the United Kingdom, adherence to the rule of law, acceptance of and tolerance of different people and their approaches towards life. And it's a point that's been made by Angela Merkel, Emmanuel Macron and others, that if you're going to have a warm and welcoming home, then you need to have a consensus around certain shared liberal principles.
Yeah, let's take that in two parts. The warm and welcoming home on the barges doesn't seem that lovely. The warm and welcoming home that ships people off to Rwanda isn't exactly traditionally what you would associate with the British come in for a cup of tea, is it?
Well,
Suella Braverman is not offering a warm and welcoming welcome to immigrants, is she?
Yes, she is, because
The language that she used last week was not warm and welcoming.
you need to draw a distinction. I think we all recognise this between people who are coming here, who are fleeing persecution, and to whom we offer that warm welcome. The 200,000 people, for example, who've fled from Ukraine, the more than 100,000 people who've come from Hong Kong, the more than 20,000 people who've come from Afghanistan. Big numbers, and people who have UK taxpayers welcoming them into their homes,
Yeah.
and those people who are coming here, who are working with people smugglers and human traffickers, and who, as a result, find themselves placed in circumstances where their own lives are at risk. We can't have a situation where our borders are being exploited by criminal gangs. And that's why the Prime Minister and I completely back the Home Secretary in taking the steps necessary to deal with illegal migration.
I'm only cutting you off because I want to get onto some territory which I know you and I have discussed before, and which I think you have some pretty unique views about. Because the other part of her point, which is about multiculturalism and all of that, is not at all abstract for you. Last year, Bradford Council produced a report that said minority communities in that city had become more isolated, and specifically that the chances of interaction between minority and majority people in Bradford had declined by 20%. So when she talks about the failure of multiculturalism, is that what she means?
Well, I think there are specific problems and challenges in specific cities. So Leicester, as we know, a little while back, had some community tensions. I've commissioned some work into what the situation was in Leicester to see what's specific to Leicester and what are the broader lessons that we can learn. Because I think there are some questions about the schools that children go to, the homes that people are living in, you know, the way in which they're allocated by local authorities and so on, that do need to be addressed in order to make sure that we can have the greatest level of harmony. But there are some cities...
But this is your failure, isn't it?
Well, I think it's a collective
You guys have been there for 13 years and things have gone backwards. It's your failure.
No, I don't think that at all, because I think that overall you can see that attitudes towards migration in this country have become warmer over time. If you compare our attitudes towards people coming from other countries now and, say, 7 or 8 years ago, we are, in Europe, the country, I think, which shows the most welcoming attitudes towards people coming here. And we're also the most successful. You need only look at our cabinet, our government and our parliament, as well as leadership of our, you know, our country and civil society to see that.
Well, your Home Secretary has a slightly different view, but let's get to the thing that you want to talk about today. And I just want to ask you one question about this. You've created this fund for towns to spruce up the high streets and all of that.
Exactly.
But by my reckoning, it's an endowment fund.
Yes.
The 50 towns that you've named will get something like, essentially, £1 million a year out of this fund. That's going to refurbish a few shops. It's not very much, is it?
It's £20 million, and it's over 10 years, and it's a
partnership. For 10 years, over for 50 towns.
55 towns, but the key thing is that that money is there in partnership with those towns, and that money is joined by other initiatives. So, for example, we spent time already in Wednesbury, in the West Midlands, a place that we both know well, West Brom, that £20 million was allocated earlier this week to them. They're using it to revive their high street, to deal effectively with antisocial behaviour. And again, in each of those communities, that additional funding will help to deal with some of the challenges that those communities themselves have identified.
I'll let you give the example, but let's be realistic. That this £1 billion that you're trumpeting is less than the lottery gives out in a single year. And more importantly, the council leaders that you're going to meet, I guess, next week, will be telling you this. They will say that grant money to English councils fell in real terms by 21% between 2010 and 2022. This is basically putting a lipstick on a pig, isn't it?
No, certainly not. The sums that we're allocating today are on top of a larger than ever allocation of money to local government, which we secured in the spending review, and it's also on top of other projects that we're undertaking to level up. I mentioned earlier the strength of our Metro mayors. Our Metro mayor in Teesside, Ben Hatchen, has brought 4,000 high-paying jobs to Redcar. Redcar is one of the towns that's also benefiting today. Redcar's MP, Jacob Young, has managed to secure funding not only for his town centre, but also for research and development, skills and industry.
All right, that's good for the ad. But one last question, which comes from the viewers, which is this. You're known for lots of things, but the aphorism for which you're probably best known is the people of this country have had enough of experts. And I know you were talking about economists, but since that point, to take an example, COVID.
Yes.
Vaccine.
Yes.
Expert Kate Bingham. Would you like to, in any way, amend your assessment of the need for experts?
Well, I did at the time. It was our colleague Faisal Islam here on Sky who asked me that question.
I know.
And I said that we had enough of experts from organisations with acronyms that had got things wrong in the past. People, you know, like the IFS and others. And the point I was making is that economic forecasting was invented... No, there was a specific... Economic forecasting was invented to make astrology look respectable. And my point is, specifically economic forecasting, I always think that you should be sceptical about that. But expertise in medicine, in history, expertise in physics, in chemistry, I absolutely revere.
So we've clarified here. Experts are good, unless they're economists, because they're idiots.
Economic forecasting. Economists can help in certain circumstances, but economic forecasting, I think, as I say, I'd rather trust Russell Grant than some economic forecasters.
Right, the London School of Economics, this is the man to talk to. Michael Gove, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.